Good morning from London, or perhaps good night, as one of our panelists today joins us from New York, and it's 3 a.m. there. I am Anne-Sylvaine Chassani, the World News Editor for the Financial Times, and I am delighted to be your moderator for an important topic, and I am told this will be a news-breaking panel, so stay tuned. In 2019 in Biarritz, the G7, presided by France at the time, asked the UN and the OECD to look at ways to channel the trillions of private money currently in the financial system to support long-term sustainable development goals, the so-called SDGs. 17 in total, including eradicating poverty and hunger, reducing inequalities, providing clean energy, and so on. This initiative was called the SDG Alignment Initiative, and since then, the coronavirus has wreaked havoc globally, causing the most severe health emergency since the Spanish flu in 1918, and causing the deepest recession since World War II. So this is making it even more difficult to achieve these goals, let alone align finance with these goals. But it is also making it even more important to find every way to help poorer countries to achieve them. The OECD estimates that before COVID, $2.5 trillion were missing to achieve those goals. And now it's probably 1 trillion more. The OECD also estimates that more than 100 million individuals will plunge into poverty because of the global pandemic. So joining me to discuss this, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, French Minister for Tourism, French Nationals Abroad and Francophonie, Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD, Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP. And also joining us from Jakarta, Shinta Kamdani, CEO of Sintesa Group and one of the co-chairs of the Global Investors for the Sustainable Development Alliance. My first question is for Monsieur Lemoyne. Bonjour, Monsieur le Ministre.
Good morning, Minister.
When you launch this initiative, you obviously have no idea that a global pandemic would undo a lot of the progress in terms of achieving the sustainable goals, including reducing poverty, notably. Did you have to recalibrate the initiative in the past year?
I would say that the global pandemic, as we've known it over the several months, has made this even more urgent to accelerate this alignment of finance with the SDGs. And the work that we started undertaking at the time, I'm thinking of the ministerial meeting on development on the 4th of July in Paris, observed several facts. The OECD, the UNDP had noted that the G7 represented 75% of the financial mass, so it was very useful for making progress here, but wasn't at the right scale for the needs, because before the crisis, it was estimated that we needed about $2.5 trillion to meet the SDGs. So calling upon private finance to involve companies, investors, savings funds was necessary. And there was a start to this, for example, through labeling. But we wanted to avoid SDG washing. We wanted something that would be, we wanted a framework to be coherent, for us all to move in the same direction. And the G7 and the Biarritz, under the chairmanship of President Macron, called upon the OECD and the UN working on this subject to try to establish a common framework. And I think we've done that now, and we're highly satisfied with that, given the urgent situation we're in.
Monsieur Goya, what is your assessment of what needs to be fixed concretely to unlock this capital in this pretty dire context?
We're facing the most profound global health, economic, and social emergency in the history of the multilateral system. In this crisis, 90 out of 122 developing countries have entered into economic recession. Even worse, when we need it most, the global development finance system is at risk of collapse. All resources available to developing countries are under stress, whether domestic or external, public, private. Even before COVID-19, the SDG financing was falling short. Now, according to the 2021 OECD outlook on financing for sustainable development, our annual SDG financing gap in developing countries was, as you mentioned appropriately, already around 2.5 trillion. Well, now we are increasing 1 trillion additional, plus there is a drop in 700 billion because there's going to be a 70% increase in terms of the needs, but also a drop in financing. So it cuts both ways. So we're talking now of total resources. The deficit is upwards of 4 trillion. So how can we deliver the 2030 agenda in these circumstances? Well, it is crucial to identify the main obstacles towards aligning finance with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. First, there is a lack of transparency and a complex proliferation of market-based standards. We see a growing risk of SDG washing, as was mentioned, where businesses and investors point out the ways in which they align with the SDGs, but without disclosing how they make a meaningful contribution to the achievement of the goals. Now, among all companies subscribing to the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, the so-called PRI, half of them, so 50% say they mention the SDGs in their reporting. That's great. But only 10% provide details how they actually integrate the SDGs in their investment strategy. Second, there is poor monitoring of non-financial returns of companies, which makes investment suboptimal. Corporations are often free to disclose on their positive actions, but they omit the negative impacts. They're very selective. This is why public and private actors need to agree on common frameworks and standards. Now, these can help us define and measure sustainable business behavior and, of course, sustainable business investment, as well as help us manage and measure the impact. And third, we lack clear regulations and the right incentives for the private sector. Many of the recovery measures and the associated expenditures to date provide support for fossil fuels, much of which is unconditional. They don't even say, okay, yes, but you over the time will, relinquish these practices, etc. No, they just give the money, particularly in developing countries. So in this respect, the right incentives need to be put in place to avoid what we would call market fragmentation and to achieve an optimal allocation of the assets. That is the other question, is where do you allocate scarce resources by definition? So this should help us achieve this optimal allocation of assets.
Mrs. Steiner, could you highlight some of the concrete examples of measures that would incentivize, as Mr. Goria said, investors to pour more money into these sustainable goals in investments? What are the right incentives? What are, this is really crucial.
Thank you, Anne-Sylvaine, and good morning, good afternoon to my fellow panelists. First of all, let me just acknowledge also that together with OECD and France, UNDP has been very excited to work on this framework, and I think both Mr. Lemoyne and Angel Goria have just provided you already with the rationale. The moment in time is as significant as the underlying challenge, which in itself is not new, but has taken on a dramatic new quality in the midst of this pandemic and the economic meltdown, and not least the partial collapse of foreign direct investment, just to mention one source. And I think where our work is now responding very much, and Biarritz, in some ways, the G7 summit anticipated perhaps not the pandemic, but the continued challenge of looking how we can align where financial markets and investments flow and invest, so to speak, in the broader development context in economies, and the outcomes that have a greater degree of compatibility with the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the midst of the pandemic, Building Back Better has become the headline for that. And I think where we see the greatest potential is, one, in creating greater transparency, making it easier both for those who wish to invest and those who wish to bring investment proposals to the market, to have a common framework. And I think what we're launching today is in many ways a great step forward, because it creates common understanding, common parameters, and thereby transparency. But at the same time, we have to achieve also mobilization. If we simply align, it's like taking your goods to the market, but there is no buyer. And I think here, what we are focused on is, one, we need to deepen the financial markets in developing countries. This is clearly still a task that is, particularly for least developed countries, something where institutional and regulatory attention is needed. But then we also need to help countries to develop the pipeline of projects and investment proposals that are attractive to investors, but at the same time deliver those public goods as well that the SDGs signal. And here, providing technical assistance to develop a viable pipeline. The SDG investor maps that UNDP today is working with a number of countries in probably the most transformative element of creating greater possibilities in the years ahead for attracting domestic and international private capital in actually delivering the SDGs. Back to you.
Well, Mrs. Kamdani, from your perspective as a CEO, how is your group responding to the current crisis, and how does that affect your commitment to integrating those SDGs in your investments?
Yes, so first of all, I think as many other countries, Indonesia also faced greatly from the pandemic, and our group actually is quite diversified. So we are, some impacted, like our hotel business would be impacted more, but some of the sectors like consumer products are still doing quite well. I think the most important thing is this whole pandemic, I think, makes us open. It's a wake-up call. So it makes us open. It's a wake-up call. So we are all transforming. We are looking this pandemic as also an opportunity for us to reset our bottom. But what I wanted to mention specifically is in how private sectors now are focusing on investing more in SDG. And I think with the alliance that has been established by the UN, the GISD Alliance, we have actually continued to act fast and at scale to mobilize resources for sustainable development. And this is the critical question in how we can play a role, how private sector can contribute is critical to fill in the gap that was mentioned before. So first, we are pushing the effort to shift the incentive and habits of key actors along the investment chain towards more long-term benchmark and indexes as one of the factors to overcome the herding behavior, which result from excessive focus on short-term returns, and thus increase the overall supply of SDG funding in the long term. Secondly, I think in addition to the policy, the agreement and contracts between asset owners and asset managers should be developed with a shift of focus to a more longer-term sustainability perspective. The existing corporate governance and investor stewardship need to be updated to move in tandem with more the renewal timeline, incorporating more long-term SDG lens, and also this long-term SDG time adjustment needs to fall into policy incentive as well as greater self-responsibility, and one cannot progress without the other. The fourth is, with this long-term mindset and instrument in place, increased guidance by a global standard setting body is called for in the current absence of leadership to ensure that the SDG are incorporated into regulation, reporting, and more. And lastly, accountability through core industry-specific SDG-related reporting standard is another important factor to motivate more active engagement. We believe that platforms are the most effective in scaling up sustainable investment by ensuring transparency of the demand and supply side and performing the efficient allocation of financing where it is the most needed. So they also serve to minimize the risk through risk-sharing instruments on an integrated platform. So another tool on risk-sharing instrument that could be scaled up is the use of, for example, the first loss guarantee to reduce investor exposure to risk and attract more private capital to the market. This is a guarantee that is a legally binding agreement under which guarantor agrees to pay part of the amount due on the loan, or another financial instrument in the event of non-payment. And finally, I wanted to say that financial institutions and corporations need to share opportunities, success, and failures in implementing SDG targets, including climate-related goals, to better identify which gap can be covered by private and public actors.
Thank you. Mr. Goria, we're seeing how difficult it is to mobilize private capital on many examples. I mean, one of them, for example, is the initiative, the debt moratorium initiative by the G20. The negotiators are they are struggling to reach a deal because they face, resistance from countries, but also private creditors are not necessarily willing to follow suit. How do you make sure that, given that private capital is withdrawing from these poor countries, this framework is going to make a difference, any difference?
Well, shifting the balance in favor of sustainable and inclusive development is key. Now, simply put, what we need is to take a beyond growth approach. This means defining societal goals in terms of well-being and income, jobs, health, environmental quality. Now, earlier I mentioned some of the key obstacles in aligning finance with the SDGs. Now we're talking about an effort which the G7 French Presidency commissioned both the UNDP and the OECD to develop a framework to align the financing. Together with Achim, we're proud to present this outcome to Minister Lemoyne, although we're going to do it only virtually. Now, this framework will help to mobilize, to enhance the development impact of private finance through its alignment to the SDGs. We have to get the two things together. Private actors are central in this framework, but public authorities also have a key role to play in providing the right environment, setting the right incentives. Now, this is why we need to insist on the advancement through the global fora, like the G7, like the G20. We need to discuss these issues, make it obvious to everybody that we're creating the right framework. Now, we will already see this framework in action at the B4IG, the Business for Inclusive Growth event this afternoon. It's a very good example. It focuses on helping companies to measure the impact of their operations on well-being through their pledge to fight inequalities. Now, we should look at the big picture. You mentioned some of these huge numbers. Trillions are already in the system. Actually, hundreds of trillions. They're held by banks, institutional investors, asset managers. Their total assets are valued at more than $379 trillion. And they have grown by about 6% per year. Now, shifting only 1%, that means 3.79 trillion. That will cover that gap that we have been talking about, the 2.5 billion plus the 2.5 trillion plus the original gap plus the additional trillion that we're now needing, and the gap, the drop in flows to developing countries. Just that 1% would do the trick. Now, this can be done by, for example, by better integrating the long-term risks of non-financial factors, climate change, global health, pandemics. Therefore, cooperation among public development banks is very, very important. And therefore, we're talking about here the Finance in Common Summit, precisely. It's one of the three pillars of the Paris Peace Forum this year. And that's what they're going to be talking about. And last but not least, different stakeholders, businesses, pension funds, investment banks, asset managers, central banks, they can take targeted actions to align with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Actors in development finance and of course, beyond development finance must collaborate to harmonize different standards, different metrics, different frameworks, different methodologies. Policies can then be adapted along the investment chain to make our savings and our investments work better for people and the planet. And of course, the question of debt is just a very small amount. You mentioned this. We're going to need more relief. And we're going to need more flows. We're going to need more ODA. The total ODA is 153 billion. For heaven's sake, you're talking only a fraction of the amounts that are being thrown at the COVID. So you can double, you can triple the amounts of ODA, and still there would be a big deficit remaining. So through these measures, we can build trust in multilateralism in the post-COVID world. This is one which you can only address successfully if you go multilateral. So I look forward to advancing this important agenda with all of you.
Mr. Steiner, how do we make sure that governments actually put in place those incentives when they themselves are dealing with widening inequalities, enormous strains on their healthcare system? It's not really the priority for them. How do we put this framework on top of their priority?
Well, I would phrase it slightly differently. I mean, there may be some governments who would not consider this their priority, but I would say most elected political leaders for most governments, these are precisely the priorities. The problem is that we need to understand that our economies are defined by public policy, by public finance, the national budgets we have, but then by really that extraordinary wealth that Angel Gurria just referred to, $399 trillion. And this is, in a sense, the bitter irony of our moment in time. The world has more cash at its disposal and is desperately searching in the financial markets, in the investment world for opportunities to invest, but is not able to land that money. At the same time, you have governments in the midst of this pandemic being squeezed in terms of fiscal space and being paralyzed in terms of its ability to act. So I think the first thing we need to focus on is that, and this is where the framework I think is very, very useful, that we are talking about how we can make the teeth wheels of public finance and public policy better connect to the teeth wheels of financial markets and investments. And I think here information asymmetry ironically remains a significant challenge. In the countries and economies where there is the greatest need to attract capital, there is often in the financial markets the least information, the least maturity, and the least experience in investing. So they are simply bypassed. This is why we also consider the framework to be very useful, because it addresses to some degree the information asymmetry. Secondly, it allows us also with the integrated national financing frameworks, the so-called INFFs, in 58 countries. UNDP is now working with governments, with national partners in helping to get a better picture quickly of public and private investment opportunities that are also shaped by policy. And let us not forget, just in the last few weeks, the future of our energy economies, the low carbon transition, has in some ways been propelled forward. So the entire investment horizon for energy technology, but also for opportunities to connect the 800 million people who still have no access to electricity, has become far more realizable than perhaps a year ago. This is strange, it's counterintuitive in the midst of the crisis, but the announcements in terms of net zero by Japan, by China, by Korea, the elections in the US, the European green stimulus, I mean, these are fundamental signals into the economy. But then we also need to address the disclosure agenda. I think this is where the framework is an extremely important contribution, and we need to provide more of these disclosure elements, including the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. We have a lot on climate. Let me also mention one more thing, because I think this is going to be crucial in this crisis. We look at economies often from averages or large players. The vast majority of businesses, private sector, but also of employment, is in fact in small, medium-scale enterprises, virtually across every economy. We need to also find ways in which we're able to target the kind of investment incentives and flows that allow these people to be part of an economic recovery and, more importantly, of an investment pathway. And that's where I hope that, whether it is a green or an SDG taxonomy, these are the tools that allow public policy, the private financial sector, and the financial markets to connect. And I think we are very, very excited by having this opportunity to have worked together, because as Ms. Kamdani said just now, the GISD, leaders in the financial markets are all looking for orientation, for signals that allow us to overcome fragmentation and also this information asymmetry. And I think this is why launching this particular framework at this moment in time is in many ways carries a double meaningfulness. Back to you.
Thank you. Before taking questions from the audience, and we have a few already, I wanted to ask Mr. Lemoine, Mr. Steiner mentioned the change, the future change of president in the White House. How do you feel that there will be renewed momentum with Joe Biden as president of the United States? And we know Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord recently, a few days ago. He wanted to withdraw from the WHO. The president-elect Joe Biden wants to rejoin all those international organizations. What do you make of this? Are you hopeful?
So what is for certain, given the different challenges that we've highlighted for the SDGs, the pandemic, we have to work together. We have to cooperate. This is why Over the last years, with President Macron, first and foremost, we have promoted multilateralism, where we should be efficient. Now people are waiting for results. So also in terms of what we're talking about this morning, the fact that the president-elect has announced that the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Agreement. This is moving things in the right direction. But what is for sure is that multilateralism should be promoted, defended, and it should also give concrete results. And I think that for today, the conclusion of works being led by the OECD just goes to show that we are moving in the right direction. And but then it's down to all of us, whether they're state actors, private actors. We must continue to maintain political momentum in order to achieve results for everybody. So I think it is very important to maintain impetus around this initiative. And I know that the G7, the British initiative, is very attentive to the matters that we're following this morning, i.e. financing SDGs. So I really do believe that in terms of our public policies, we need to roll this out, integrate it into our budgets, our laws. Let me give you an example. In France, we have decided to allow companies to integrate in their purpose, which goes well beyond just profit. They should declare themselves as companies which comply with a number of environmental objectives, sustainable development. So it means also changing company statutes. So we offer a framework which allows the private sector to move in the right direction and align financing towards the SDGs. And of course, we need to adapt our own political tools, and this is why we asked the AFD and development banks to finance projects that are aligned with the SDGs, support those projects, for example, on energy. So we must continue to be present in terms of increase in funds. We can see that there is more need for official development aid, as Mr. Gourrier said. So 300. There's still a big gap in terms of financing, and so that's an awful lot of money. So we need to continue to increase that, increase it by 17% in terms of official development aid. So we are continuing in that vein, and we also have to work on standards for private companies, but states and budgets are performance indicators, and we've seen this in the organic budget law. Those laws need to be adapted and oriented towards the SDGs, so that loans and money which is allocated, so that be done as virtuously as possible. And so really roll out this common framework that has been worked on by the OECD and the UNDP.
So we're going to take some questions from the audience, and I have two questions on the human rights and the need and investments. One asks, how do you balance the urgent need for investment and the risk that these new investments are done without sufficient human rights due diligence and consultation with local communities and civil society? And there is another one on human rights and environmental defenders reporting negative impacts on development projects, currently facing violent attacks, threats, and lawsuits aiming to silence them. I don't know, perhaps Mrs. Kambani, do you have any thoughts on that as an investor yourself? Do you feel like the due diligence and human rights is not enough?
I think obviously right now more and more private sector companies are trying to align to SDG and incorporating SDG into their business model. I think human rights is an important issue, and I think when corporation now trying to establish what we call report on the sustainability report. I think human rights become also a part of due diligence that needs to happen. I think I have to say that in Indonesia, of course, we are still quite lagging behind in this. And this is why part of the important element that we are currently doing is partnership. So we have essentially alliances with industry association and leading company to explore and identify and also articulate the industrial potential impacts. And this is also related to human rights. So we are now also educating and socializing companies in terms of the specific target of the SDG agenda. And I think when we want to be part of the global players, and we want to be part, a lot of our products is part of the global supply chain. We have no choice but to put also human rights as an essential element in terms of the due diligence. So it's a lot of effort that still need to be done, especially for us in Indonesia. But I mentioned also that GISD is also supporting in this area, that in light of the collective action on a global scale, we understand that there's need for a more harmonization of reporting standard. And while industry-specific core metrics were needed to capture the impact from product and services, I think global efforts on reporting have yet to reach a consensus. And also, we are supporting existing initiatives that also have been proposed on the core operational metrics, such as the World Economic Forum, and work on the SDG relevant information. So what we're doing is now bringing the private actors to come together, pay more attention on some of these SDG issues, and also how they can incorporate it in their business and invest more in SDG. So that's what we are currently looking at.
Another set of questions is related to the Paris Climate Accord. One viewer is asking, how do we ensure banks stop financing this project that directly undermine the climate goals? And another is asking, how do you think the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement will influence this agenda? Perhaps Mr. Goria, you want to answer that question related to climate change?
Yes, let's remind ourselves, first and foremost, we have to fight COVID, and we have to fight the consequences, and we have to support the unemployed and the SMEs, as Achim said, and those sectors that are hard hit, like tourism, etc., the services. But let's remind ourselves that the single most important intergenerational responsibility that we have is to protect the planet. That continues to be the case, that remains to be the case. And therefore, when we see conducts that are dissonant with this objective, especially in the medium and the long term, we absolutely have to call the attention to that. And we have to denounce it, basically. Why is it that today we are still having 70% of the emissions are not taxed? They don't have a price. So how are we going to change the conduct? How is it possible, for example, that, well, you were mentioning that the banks are still financing projects that are going to pollute? And the problem is that if you're financing a project today, it's going to be there in 40 years' time, because the factories that we're building today are going to last forever. So the technology that we apply today, it's not for 2050. The problem is that whatever we decide today is going to affect the world in 2050. But it's also going to affect the world all the way from here to 2050. So basically, we just have to keep our eye on the ball. We can't miss this point. We have to insist policies of governments, they are putting more money into harmful policies for biodiversity than they're putting to defend biodiversity. This is the same governments that we are talking to, the same governments that are pushing for better policies. Those are the same governments that are financing the subsidies for fossil fuels. And the problem is that now, with the COVID response, with the trillions, 12 trillion so far, they're just throwing money at this. And in many cases, what is happening is that instead of being targeted and very well thought through, in the second stage, you have to be much more consistent. You have to be much more targeted. In the first stage, one can understand. It was a shock. It was a tremendous shock. You had to, helicopter money, whatever you would say. That was okay. But now, when you go forward, you have to be much more selective, and you have to keep the planet first and foremost in our minds.
Mr. Lemoine, do you want to respond to Mr. Goria? There are indeed a lot of contradictions in the air that's been, allocated for the recovery, the post-COVID recovery. How France is, how do you approach this? I mean, on the European, national level, but also European level, in terms of making sure that the climate goals are still, in everybody's mind.
Well, what is clear is that there's been massive support for the economy, and Guria was right to mention the helicopter money, because we have a recovery plan, 100 billion. This was presented in the month of September, and we wanted this recovery plan to be the opportunity for our companies to be able to make transformations, transform the way they produce. If we look at the tourism sector, we have set up a dedicated fund for sustainable tourism to make sure that hoteliers, restaurant owners can change their practices, can improve their various tools. And so we have provided support to our national airlines. But the deal was to review practices that were not necessary. Perhaps there were alternatives using the train, for example. So the support is there, but there's also, there's they have to do to achieve this. So let me remind you that we haven't got on the one hand developing countries. We are all developing countries in terms of sustainable development. And so we have an awful long way to go together.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time. I want to thank all my panelists for a good discussion, and the audience for their questions. I guess now the work begins. We may have a vaccine in sight, but the economic fallout will be massive and long-lasting. So good luck, everybody, and have a good day.